It was 2:30 in the morning in Houston, Texas. The streets around St. Michael's Catholic Church were deserted, bathed in the faint glow of old street lamps. A stray cat darted between parked cars, and the distant hum of a highway was the only sound breaking the silence. From the sidewalk across the street, a figure in black stood motionless in the shadows. Wei Chen, a name murmured in police precincts from Dallas to San Antonio, was about to cross a line he'd once vowed never to breach. Inside the rectory, Father Liang, the young parish priest, slept soundly after a long day of confessions and preparations for the Feast of the Assumption. A single candle flickered in the chapel, its light dancing across the polished marble floor. 3 miles away, Officer Mei Lin sat in her cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee, scanning the quiet blocks on her night patrol. She didn't know it yet, but before dawn, she'd be inside St. Michael's, staring at security footage that would shake her understanding of reality. Across town, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, Hao Nguyen, Wei's childhood friend and the one who'd tipped him off, paced nervously. He'd told Wei about the thousands in cash and gold piled at the church's altar. But even Hao felt a chill at the thought of robbing a sacred place. The church stood like a sentinel in the dark, its red brick facade and white steeple glowing faintly under the moonlight. Inside, bouquets of fresh lilies surrounded a life-sized statue of the Blessed Mother, her painted gaze lowered in prayer, hands folded over a white robe. At her feet lay envelopes stuffed with bills, gold chains coiled in offering plates, and velvet boxes holding diamond rings, gifts from hundreds of parishioners over the past week. Wei's boots were silent as he slipped from the alley into the narrow back entrance. He'd picked countless locks in his life, but the click of this one felt heavier. Pushing the door open, he was met by the scent of incense and a faint sweetness, like flowers after rain. Down the center aisle, stained glass windows cast ghostly colors across the pews, even in the dim light. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was dense, as if the air itself held its breath. A lone taxi rolled past outside, its headlights briefly sweeping the church steps. In the apartment above the laundromat, Hao lit another cigarette, trying to shake an unshakable feeling. At the precinct, Officer Lin noted the time, 2:36 a.m., unaware she'd just marked the moment Wei stepped into the nave. He didn't rush to the altar. Old habits made him check corners, scan for movement, listen for footsteps. The security cameras, ancient and dust-covered, were just as Hao had described. Satisfied, Wei moved toward the left transept where the Blessed Mother's statue stood, surrounded by candles. Each step pulled him deeper into an invisible weight. The offerings at her feet gleamed under his flashlight, gold chains, diamond-studded watches, rolls of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. A small, bitter smile crossed his face. Hao hadn't exaggerated. Then something shifted. The air, the weight in the room, the sense of solitude, it all changed in an instant. That's where this story truly begins. Because in the next 60 seconds, Wei Chen, a man who'd stolen from the wealthy, the struggling, and everyone in between, would hear his name spoken by a voice that shouldn't have been there. And from that moment, nothing in his life, or the lives of those touched by his story, would ever be the same. Long before Wei Chen set foot in St. Michael's that August night, his name had already spread like a whispered warning through Dallas's back alleys. On the city's south side, in a low-income housing complex bordered by chain-link fences and cracked sidewalks, Wei's story began. His father, a former factory worker with a sharp temper and an even sharper exit, left when Wei was 8. His mother, Mei Chen, worked double shifts as a diner waitress, pouring coffee for truckers and scraping by to keep the lights on. Some weeks, the fridge held only a carton of milk and a few eggs. Neighbors remembered Wei as the kid always running, sometimes to the corner store for bread, sometimes from trouble. Mrs. Kim, the widow in 3B, recalled how Wei mowed her lawn for $5. He had a look, she once told a friend, like he'd seen too much of the world for a boy his age. At 13, Wei's first real step into crime came on a sweltering July afternoon. The convenience store on Jefferson Boulevard had its door propped open, the bell above it broken. The cashier was distracted with a delivery. Wei's eyes caught a man's leather wallet poking out of a jacket pocket on the counter. No one saw him take it. The $42 inside felt like a fortune. Word spread fast among the neighborhood kids. Wei wasn't just lucky, he was quick, careful, invisible. By 16, he was running with a loose crew of teens who knew which backyards had unlocked sheds, which stores kept light registers, and which pawn shops asked no questions. Somewhere along the way, the idea that theft was wrong stopped troubling him. In Wei's mind, his targets could afford the loss. They'd replace what he took. "It's not like I'm hurting anyone," he told Hao once. Hao laughed, but even then, something in Wei's tone sounded like self-conviction. By 22, petty theft had escalated to high-value burglaries. Wei learned to bypass home alarms, crack old safes, and vanish before police arrived. Surveillance cameras caught glimpses of a tall man in a hoodie, face always shadowed. Getaway car plates were always stolen. Detective Jian Zhang of the Dallas Police Department had a file on Wei thicker than a phone book. We knew it was him, Zhang would later say. But knowing and proving are two different things. He was a ghost. Over the next decade, Wei's operation stretched beyond Dallas to Fort Worth, San Antonio, and eventually Houston. Luxury homes in gated communities, jewelry stores on quiet Sunday nights, even a hospital storeroom where he lifted medical equipment worth tens of thousands. His jobs were quick, clean, and left no fingerprints. For all his skill, Wei Chen kept no crew. He trusted no one fully, not even Hang Guin, who only surfaced to share tips or move stolen goods. You start splitting jobs, Wei once said, and sooner or later, you're splitting time in prison. But a life like that carried its own emptiness. In his small apartment above a pawn shop, Wei would flip through TV channels at 3 a.m., surrounded by things he didn't care about, watches still in their boxes, electronics never unwrapped, jewelry hidden in shoeboxes. The more he stole, the less it meant. His mother, Mei Ling, stopped calling years ago, not out of indifference, but because she couldn't bear watching her son sink deeper into the life she'd fought to shield him from. Wei's younger sister, Li Na, sent a Christmas card once, no return address, just a scribbled "hope you're okay" beneath a photo of her kids. On the streets, Wei's reputation was near mythical. Other thieves spoke of him like a ghost story, the man who could slip in and out without tripping an alarm, leaving nothing but the absence of something valuable. But in the quiet moments, when the adrenaline faded, cracks appeared. Nights when he'd stand at his window, staring at the flickering neon of the 24-hour laundromat below, wondering, never aloud, if this was all his life would be. Those cracks deepened the night. How came to him with a beer in one hand and a secret in the other, a secret about a church in Houston and an altar brimming with cash and gold. It began on a Tuesday night in a dimly lit bar on Houston's east side, where the jukebox churned out old country ballads and the air smelled of fried food. Wei sat in his usual corner booth, a half-empty bottle of Lone Star in front of him, when Hang Guin slid into the seat across from him. Hao looked older than the last time Wei had seen him, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, a nervous twitch in his jaw. But his grin was the same, the kind that promised trouble. "You ever hear of St. Michael's?" Hao asked, leaning in. Wei gave him a flat look. "The church? Sure. Why?" Hao lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder. "Right now, that place is sitting on more cash and gold than you've seen in years." Wei didn't bite immediately. He knew how stories could grow in the telling. "You're wasting your time. Churches don't keep that kind of money lying around." "This one does," Hao insisted. "It's the week of the Feast of the Assumption. Biggest celebration they've had in years. People have been bringing donations every day, envelopes of cash, jewelry, family heirlooms, all left at the altar." Wei took a slow sip, his face unreadable. "You're saying they just leave it there?" Hao nodded. "The old priest, Father Zhou, left for a conference this morning. Just the young priest and a nun running things now. No night guards, 2 cameras, old as dirt. My cousin does cleaning there. She's never seen so much in one place." From behind the bar, the bartender, a woman in her 50s named Lan Pham, noticed the two men huddled together. She'd seen Wei in here plenty of times, usually alone. Hao's presence and their hushed voices made her keep an eye on them. Wei leaned back, arms crossed. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Hao said. "Sunday morning, they take it all to the bank. Until then, it's just sitting there. I'd bet 50 grand, maybe more. $50,000. For most, it was life-changing. For Wei, it was a payday that could let him vanish for a year, maybe 2. Still, something in his gut twisted at the idea of robbing a church. Across town, in a small apartment, Hao's cousin, Lin Tran, was finishing her evening shift at St. Michael's. She had no idea her offhand comment to Hao about the pile of donations would spark something like this. To her, it was just a remark about the parishioners' generosity during the feast week. Back in the booth, Wei's silence stretched. Hao pushed. "Think about it, man. No alarm's worth a damn. Back door opens into a blind alley. In and out in 15 minutes. Wei shook his head. "I don't hit churches." Hao smirked. "You've hit hospitals, man. What's the difference?" The words landed heavier than Wei expected. He didn't answer, just drummed his fingers on the table. Later that night, he walked home through humid streets, the air thick with the smell of rain on asphalt. In his apartment above the pawn shop, he stood at the window, staring at the laundromat's flickering neon. He told himself it was a bad idea. Then he told himself it was just another job. By the time dawn paled the sky, he'd made up his mind. The next 3 days were reconnaissance. Wei visited the plaza where St. Michael's stood, blending in with tourists snapping photos of the historic brick facade. He sat at a cafe across the street, nursing coffee while tracking the comings and goings. From the corner booth inside Min's taqueria, the owner, Tuan Lu, watched him through the window. Tuan didn't know Wei's name but recognized the type, someone who noticed everything and wrote nothing down. Wei saw the patterns. The back alley stayed empty most nights. The 2 security cameras, one over the front doors, another fixed on the altar, were 15 years old, just as Hao said. The young priest, Father Liang, was in and out during the day, usually alone. The nun, Sister Mei, came and went with grocery bags and flower arrangements. Every day, more offerings piled up at the foot of the Blessed Mother's statue. Families brought envelopes, elderly couples laid down jewelry boxes, children placed coins in polished brass bowls. By Friday night, Wei knew the timing, the weak spots, the entry point. The plan was simple: enter through the back door at 2:30 a.m. with a pick set on the outdated lock, head to the left transept where the Blessed Mother's statue stood, fill the backpack, cash first, then jewelry, then gold, and exit the way he came. 3 blocks to his parked truck, gone in under 15 minutes. No excess movement, no wandering, no mistakes. Hao offered to help, but Wei refused. 1 man in, 1 man out, no witnesses, no splits. On Saturday night, while Houston buzzed with weekend life, bars packed, music spilling into the streets, Wei ate a quiet dinner at a diner near his place. Steak, eggs, black coffee. Wei paid in cash, tipped well, and walked home without looking over his shoulder. At 1:55 a.m., his alarm buzzed, though he was already awake. Black cargo pants, black long-sleeve shirt, gloves, boots. The backpack lay empty on the kitchen counter beside a rolled-up tool pouch. Catching his reflection in the mirror before leaving, Wei saw the same face that had outsmarted motion sensors, cracked safes, and outrun sirens. But deep behind his eyes, a flicker of unease stirred, something he couldn't name. By 2:28 a.m., he was in the alley behind St. Michael's. The world was silent except for the distant hum of the freeway. The plan was locked in his mind, each step as familiar as his own heartbeat. What he couldn't know, what no one could, was that this job would not end as he'd envisioned. It would end in a way that would make his name known far beyond the streets he'd haunted for years. The alley behind St. Michael's was a forgotten sliver of the city, narrow and tucked between old brick buildings. Its cracked asphalt was littered with bottle caps and faded chalk markings from kids who no longer played there. At 2:30 a.m., it was pure darkness. Wei's boots made no sound as he moved, gloved hands slipping the pick into the old brass lock. Years of practice had taught him the language of tumblers and pins, and within 3 minutes, the door gave way with a quiet, reluctant click. Down the street, the faint roar of a passing truck faded into silence. Stepping inside, the air shifted, cooler, heavier, carrying the faint scent of incense, candle wax, and something sweeter, perhaps lilies. In the rectory apartment above, Father Liang stirred in his sleep, unaware of the intruder below. The young priest had stayed up late, preparing Sunday's homily, never imagining danger would slip through the church's back alley. Wei shut the door behind him, standing briefly in the dark corridor. His flashlight beam cut a narrow path along the worn wooden floorboards, grazing framed photos of First Communions and parish picnics. The faces in the pictures seemed to watch him, but he didn't linger. He moved with precision, 5 paces forward, turn right, 10 more steps. The sacristy should be here, and it was. The small room smelled faintly of cedar from the vestment closets. Cabinets lined the walls, filled with altar cloths, candles, and prayer books, but no envelopes, no gold, no jewelry. Wei's brow furrowed. He scanned the room again. Nothing but liturgical tools. Either Hao's cousin had been wrong, or the goods were elsewhere. Across town, Hao sat in his apartment, chain-smoking by the window, picturing Wei returning with a backpack full of loot. He didn't know that Wei was standing in an empty sacristy, recalculating. Wei stepped back into the hall. The main nave was the only other option. He moved quietly toward the heart of the church, his flashlight beam catching stained glass windows that shimmered despite the lack of sunlight. The silence here was denser, almost alive. As he entered the nave, the space opened around him. Rows of dark wooden pews stretched toward the sanctuary, their varnished surfaces reflecting fragments of colored light from the street lamps outside. Then he saw it, in the left transept, bathed in the dim glow of votive candles, stood the life-sized statue of the Blessed Mother, painted with delicate detail, her head bowed in prayer beneath a flowing blue mantle. At her feet, the floor was crowded with offerings, envelopes thick with cash, gold chains tangled like sleeping serpents, silver crucifixes, velvet ring boxes, and watches gleaming in the candlelight. Bouquets of fresh lilies and roses surrounded it all, their fragrance rich and almost overwhelming. Wei's pulse quickened. This was it. He crossed the marble floor in measured steps, each one echoing faintly in the vaulted ceiling. Kneeling before the statue, not in reverence, but for efficiency, he set his backpack down and worked fast. Cash first, thick bundles of 20s and 100s. Then jewelry, each piece slipping into the dark mouth of the bag, a gold chain heavy enough to be worth thousands, a diamond-studded watch, coins that jingled softly, possibly collectible. A block away, in a small apartment, Lin Tran, house cousin, was still awake, reading in bed. The lily she'd placed at the Blessed Mother's feet that day had been the last she could afford from her paycheck. She'd never imagined someone was pushing those flowers aside to reach the envelopes beneath. Wei worked quickly, but a weight settled over him, one he couldn't name. It wasn't guilt, he'd shed that years ago. This was different, a prickle at the back of his neck, the uncanny sense he wasn't alone. He froze mid-movement, his hand wrapped around a gold crucifix. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to the statue's face. The painted eyes, which should have been fixed downward, seemed almost alive in the flickering candlelight. He told himself it was the shadows. But then the fragrance of lilies deepened, filling his lungs in an overwhelming wave. His flashlight slipped slightly, casting the Blessed Mother's shadow tall against the wall. For a fraction of a second, no, he was certain, the shadow moved differently than the statue. In that moment, the job was still in motion, the plan still possible. But something had shifted, something beyond money, alarms, or escape routes. Within the next breath, Wei Chen would discover that the treasure he'd come to steal was not the most valuable thing in this church, and what he was about to encounter would change his life forever. The first sign was the eyes. Wei had seen enough statues to know their faces never changed, painted irises locked in place. But as the candlelight quivered in the still air, the Blessed Mother's eyes, once cast gently downward, lifted and fixed directly on him. His breath caught. The gold crucifix in his hand grew heavier. Up in the rectory, Father Liang stirred again, no dream this time, just a faint, unplaceable sound rippling through the walls, a vibration more than a noise, as if the building itself were exhaling. He glanced at his clock, 2:41 a.m. Back in the nave, Wei's flashlight slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a metallic clang that echoed too loudly in the quiet. He didn't move to retrieve it. He couldn't. Something unseen rooted him in place. The air thickened. The sweetness of lilies grew so intense it nearly made Wei dizzy. Then, without warning, a voice filled the space, not from the statue, not from any single direction, but everywhere at once. Wei, it said softly, his name carrying a weight that pressed against his chest. The voice was unmistakably feminine, warm, and gentle, yet laced with undeniable authority. At that exact moment, 3 blocks away, Officer Mei Lin's radio crackled with static in her patrol car. No call came through, but she frowned, tapping the volume knob, feeling an odd prickle on her arms. In the church, Wei's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The voice continued, weaving through the air like a current. "Son, what are you doing here?" Each word vibrated in his bones. He shook his head, managing a faint whisper. I. For 15 years, you have taken what is not yours, the voice said. From the hungry, the old, those who could not afford to lose anything. Do you think I have not seen? Wei's knees buckled, and he found himself kneeling, not in submission, but because his body refused to hold him up. The backpack slumped open beside him, spilling glints of gold chains and folded bills onto the marble floor. I know your hunger, the voice softened. I know your father left. I know your mother worked until her hands ached and her body broke. I know the streets taught you to take before you were taken from. But, my son, stealing has not made you strong. It has made you empty. Hot tears blurred Wei's vision. He hadn't cried since his mother's funeral decades ago. Now, sobs came in raw, unguarded waves. Don't cry for me, the voice murmured. Cry for yourself, for the love you turned away, for the roads you abandoned because they were harder to walk. Somewhere above, a votive candle sputtered, then flared briefly brighter. Wei swallowed hard, forcing out words. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I have always been here, Wei, the voice said. In every choice, every wrong turn, every night you went to sleep feeling nothing but the weight of your own soul. I have waited for you to come home. Her gaze, or what felt like it, held him steady. For the first time in years, something stirred in his chest besides adrenaline and calculation, hope. What do I do? His voice cracked, the question spilling out before he could stop it. You already know, the voice answered. And he did. With trembling hands, Wei began emptying the backpack. Bundles of cash, jewelry, watches, coins, he placed them gently back at the Blessed Mother's feet, just as they had been. The metal clinked softly against the marble, the sound oddly cleansing. When the last item was returned, he stayed kneeling, unsure of what came next. The voice came again, quieter now. This is only the first step. You must repair what you have broken. Find those you have hurt. Return what you can. Ask for their forgiveness, even if they do not give it. Live with honesty, no matter the cost. Wei's throat tightened. I don't have anything left. No money. No honest work. Nothing. You have your life. You have your soul. That is enough to begin. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink deep. The air felt lighter now, the lily scent fading to something delicate. When it is hardest, the voice added, come here. Sit with me. Speak to me. I will always listen. Then, silence. The Blessed Mother's eyes lowered again, returning to the serene gaze they'd held for decades. Wei stayed where he was until the first pale light of morning crept through the stained glass, painting the floor in blues and reds. He didn't know how long he'd been there, only that when he finally stood, he was not the man who had walked in. Wei remained on his knees, the cold marble pressing through his pants, as if the building itself held him in place. The voice's last echo lingered, faint as the after-ring of a bell. This is only the first step. Those words weighed heavier than any chain or lock he'd ever carried. Above in the rectory, Father Liang woke with an uneasy feeling that something profound had occurred. He padded barefoot to the chapel balcony, leaning over the railing to glance into the nave. From that height, he saw only a lone figure kneeling before the Blessed Mother, shoulders bowed in what looked like prayer or surrender. Wei didn't see him. He was staring at the offerings he'd returned, bundles of bills, gold chains, jeweled rings glittering softly in the candlelight. The voice had been clear, find those you have hurt. Return what you can. Ask for their forgiveness, even if they do not give it. Live with honesty, no matter the cost. The thought twisted his stomach. 15 years of jobs, hundreds of victims, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars scattered to pawn shops, black market dealers, and people who wouldn't remember his face until he stood at their door. Some would hate him. Some would slam the door. Some would call the police the moment they recognized him. He thought of Mrs. Park, the widow whose husband's watch he'd stolen years ago. Of Mr. Sato, who'd come home from his second job to find his store's register emptied. Of faces he'd never bothered to remember until now, returning in fragments like a puzzle dumped on the floor. For a moment, the old Wei stirred, the one who planned every move, calculated every risk, left no trace. That Wei would have walked away, convinced himself he'd imagined it all. But no one could unhear that voice, unfeel its weight. Across town, in a one-bedroom apartment above a taco shop, Hao Nguyen sat in front of the TV, its glow painting his face. He was expecting a call any minute, the kind that came with the sound of tires on wet pavement and the clink of heavy zippers. He didn't know Wei's backpack now lay empty beside him on the marble floor. Wei closed his eyes. The plan was gone, the escape route, the payday, the months of laying low. They'd evaporated like breath in cold air. In their place was something terrifyingly simple, the idea of starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back, his own 2 hands, and whatever work he could find. I don't even know where to start, Wei whispered. But the answer had already been given, you already know. It wouldn't be about grand gestures or instant redemption. It would be a long road, day after day of hard, unglamorous work, saving dollar by dollar, knocking on doors he'd once slipped past under cover of night. The candles flickered as if stirred by a draft, though the air remained still. And just like that, Wei knew. He would sell everything he owned of value, truck, TV, watches, even the furniture in his apartment. Whatever cash it brought would go to the first names and addresses he could remember. If they cursed him, so be it. If they called the police, he'd face it. If they forgave him, it would be their choice, not his to demand in a single visit. From the balcony, Father Liang watched Wei rise slowly, as if testing the weight of his own legs. He saw the man glance once more at the Blessed Mother's face, then bow his head in a gesture that was neither criminal caution nor ritual devotion, something in between. Wei picked up the empty backpack. It felt strange now, almost a reminder of what he'd carried in and what he was leaving behind. He didn't know how long it would take to undo the damage he'd done, or if it was even possible. But as he turned toward the door, a clarity bloomed in his chest that no heist had ever given him. A quiet promise formed, he would not disappear this time. He would return, not as a thief, but as a man willing to make things right, no matter the cost. The first step had been taken. By sunrise, Wei was back in his apartment above the pawn shop. The place looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because of what he knew he had to do. Every object carried a price tag in his mind, the flat-screen TV on the wall, the leather recliner he'd never cared for, the polished oak coffee table, the truck keys hanging by the door. 2 days later, the living room was bare. The TV went to a second-hand electronics store for half its worth. The truck was sold to a used car lot, cash with no questions asked. Watches, chains, and the few high-end tools he'd kept for big jobs were boxed and handed to pawnbrokers. By week's end, Wei had just over $9,200 in an envelope and nothing left in the apartment but a mattress on the floor, a folding chair, and a coffee mug. Across town, Hao Nguyen heard about the truck sale from a mutual contact. "He's cashing out," the guy said. Hao assumed Wei was skipping town to dodge trouble. He didn't know the money wasn't for escape, it was for repayment. Wei's first stop was a modest single-story house on Houston's outskirts, its white siding faded under the Texas sun. He stood at the edge of the driveway for a full minute before walking to the door, envelope in hand. Inside, Mrs. Eunji Park, a widow in her late 60s, was folding laundry when the knock came. She opened the door to a tall man in plain jeans and a worn flannel shirt. His face seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it until he spoke. "Mrs. Park, 3 years ago, I took your late husband's watch." Her grip on the door tightened. "You," she said. "I can't give it back," Wei said, his voice steady but low. "But I can give you what it was worth, and I can say I'm sorry." He held out the envelope. She didn't take it at first, studying his face for signs of deceit. Then, slowly, she reached for it, her hand trembling. "Why now?" she asked. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. The door didn't slam. The police weren't called. She nodded once and closed it softly, leaving Wei alone on the porch with the sound of his own heartbeat. The next address took him to a weathered corner store in East Houston. The sign above read Sato's Market, paint peeling but the light still on. Mr. Hiroshi Sato, now in his 70s, stood behind the counter. Wei stepped inside, the bell chiming. Sato glanced up, recognition flaring in his eyes. "You," he said, voice tight. "I know," Wei replied. He placed an envelope on the counter. 2,000, plus interest, for the night I emptied your register." Sato stared at it, then at him. "I should call the cops right now." "You should," Wei said, unmoving. "But I hope you'll take the money instead." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Sato slid the envelope toward himself. "You're lucky I believe in second chances," he muttered. Not every encounter was so restrained. One man slammed the door before Wei could finish speaking. Another threatened him with a baseball bat, shouting that some wounds couldn't be fixed with cash. Wei didn't argue. He left envelopes in their mailboxes and walked away. By the end of the first month, the $9,200 was gone, scattered across a dozen households. Wei took a job pouring concrete for a local construction company, working long hours under the blistering Texas sun, paid in weekly checks. Every Friday, he set aside half for rent and food, the rest went into a growing stack of envelopes. In a diner off I-45, Lin Tran, Hao's cousin, overheard two regulars talking about a man paying back old robberies. She didn't connect it to the stranger she'd glimpsed in St. Michael's that night. Not yet. Wei's evenings were spent with pen and paper, listing every job, address, and name he could recall. The list was longer than he'd expected. The thought of how far he had to go was overwhelming, but for the first time, overwhelming didn't mean impossible. Each knock on a door, each awkward conversation, each envelope pushed across a threshold was a brick laid on the road back from who he'd been. Some forgave him on the spot, others didn't. Either way, the debt was his to pay. And somewhere in that long, exhausting process, the man who'd once measured his life in stolen goods began to measure it in something else entirely, the number of wrongs he could set right before his time ran out. 6 months had passed since that August night. Wei Chen's list of addresses remained long, but the stack of crossed-out names was growing. One evening, after a grueling shift on the construction site, he found himself standing before St. Michael's again. This time, it wasn't under cover of darkness. The sun was still up, casting amber light across the brick facade and white steeple. He hesitated at the steps. People moved in and out, some lighting candles, others carrying grocery bags from the parish pantry. None gave him a second glance. For a man used to avoiding crowds, the anonymity felt almost strange. Inside, the church smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. The candles near the Blessed Mother's statue flickered, their light steady despite the open doors. At the altar, arranging lilies in a tall glass vase, stood Father Liang. Wei walked slowly down the aisle, his work boots echoing against the marble. The young priest looked up, hands pausing over the flowers. "Father," Wei began, voice low, "my name's Wei Chen. I left a note here months ago." Recognition flashed in Father Liang's eyes, the man who'd promised to return and make things right. Wei nodded. "I think it's time I told you the whole story." They sat in a small office off the nave, half-drawn blinds striping the walls with late afternoon light. Wei spoke plainly, house tip, the empty sacristy, the offerings at the Blessed Mother's feet, the eyes that moved, the voice that called his name. He described returning every item that night and how the months since had been spent repaying debts no one expected him to repay. Father Liang listened without interrupting. When Wei finished, the priest leaned back, quiet for a moment. You know, Father Liang said finally, those cameras you thought were too old to work? They do. They recorded everything. Wei's stomach tightened. Everything? Everything, Father Liang confirmed. You entering the church, kneeling at the statue, emptying your bag, and then something else. A light, coming from nowhere we could see, surrounding the statue and you. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small USB drive. The diocese reviewed it. The bishop called it a miracle of conversion. He told me to wait, that you'd come back. In the rectory kitchen later that evening, Father Liang replayed the video for Wei. From the fixed camera's angle, the events looked surreal. Wei approaching with deliberate intent, the candles flaring brighter, the man dropping to his knees, hands moving to return each item as if guided by something unseen. Even on grainy footage, the change in his face was undeniable, hardness giving way to something raw, almost childlike. You should tell this story, Father Liang said. Wei shook his head. I'm not a public speaker. It's not about speaking well. It's about letting people know what happened. There are people in this city who've given up on change, on God working in ordinary lives. Your story could reach them. Wei stared at the floor. He'd faced slammed doors and men with baseball bats, but standing before a congregation felt worse. The following Sunday, the church was nearly full. Late morning sun streamed through the stained glass, scattering reds and blues across the pews. Wei sat in the front row, palms damp. After the final hymn, Father Liang stepped to the lectern. Before we go, he said, I'd like to invite someone to share a testimony. A man who's walked a long road to be here today. Wei rose slowly, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. He turned to face 100 pairs of eyes, curious, skeptical, expectant. My name is Wei Chen, he began, voice steady but unpolished. For 15 years, I was a thief. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. He told them about that August night, the plan, the statue, the voice, the decision to walk away from the life he'd built. He spoke of the restitution, the slammed doors, the rare moments of forgiveness. When he finished, tears glistened in some eyes, thoughtful silence in others. In the back pew, an older man clasped his hands tighter. In the fourth row, a woman leaned into her teenage son, whispering something only he could hear. Father Liang closed the service with a prayer. As the congregation dispersed, a small group gathered around Wei. Some thanked him, others shared their own stories. One young man, no older than 17, stood off to the side, watching silently. That night, Wei sat in his empty apartment and realized the story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who needed to believe the past didn't define the future, to everyone who might hear it next. The following Sunday, St. Michael's pews were a little fuller. Word had spread quickly, whispered after Mass, mentioned over coffee at the diner, passed along at the grocery store. People came not just to pray but to see the man whose story had stirred a congregation that rarely spoke of miracles in the present tense. Among the faces that morning was Min Tran, a 17-year-old who'd sat in the back row the week before. He'd spent the last year skipping classes, running petty theft jobs with older boys. Hearing Wei speak had lodged a question in his mind he couldn't shake: if he could stop, why can't I? After the service, Min lingered in the vestibule, pretending to study the bulletin board until Wei walked past. Mr. Chen, he said, eyes fixed on the floor. I've taken stuff, too. Not big stuff, just enough. Wei paused, reading the tension in the boy's posture. What's your name? Min. Wei nodded. I started at 12. Didn't stop until I was 35. You've got time to walk away before it becomes your life. Min looked doubtful. It's not that easy. I didn't say it was easy, Wei replied. But it's worth it. He handed the boy a card with a phone number. Call me tomorrow. Wei offered, I can get you a spot on the construction crew. It's hard work, but it's honest. The next day, Min Tran showed up at the site. By Friday, with his first paycheck in hand, he paid back the store he'd stolen from the month before. Others came forward, too. Mrs. Kim, a retired teacher, approached Wei one afternoon to say she'd forgiven a burglary from years back, one she now believed might have been his doing. She'd never proven it, but seeing his change had freed her from the bitterness she'd carried. In a quiet booth at Bao's coffee shop, Officer Mei Lin slid into the seat across from Wei. She'd been one of the officers who reviewed the church's security footage. I've been in law enforcement 15 years, she told him. I don't see people like you, people who turn around. Don't stop. People are watching, even when you don't know it. Wei began speaking at community centers, then at a youth detention facility on the edge of town. He didn't dress like a motivational speaker or read from notes. He just told the truth, about the lies he'd believed, the fear he'd lived with, and the night that broke it all open. At one session in the detention center, a boy in the back raised his hand. So, you're saying if I just say sorry, it's all good? Wei shook his head. No. Sorry is just the start. You've got to live the apology every day, for as long as it takes. His words weren't polished, but they were real. In rooms full of kids who could smell insincerity a mile away, that counted for more than anything. The work site became part of the change, too. Over the next year, Wei brought on 3 young men teetering on the edge of serious trouble. One quit within a week. Another stayed long enough to save for trade school. Min, though, stayed. 2 years later, he was one of the best on the crew, taking night classes to become an electrician. In the evenings, Wei still returned to St. Michael's. Sometimes he'd find strangers kneeling at the Blessed Mother's feet, whispering prayers. Other times, Father Liang would ask him to speak to a visitor curious about that story they'd heard. The most unexpected change was the calls that started coming, not from people demanding money, but from those asking for help to make things right. One night, Tuan Lu, owner of Min's taqueria, called out of the blue. "I've been holding on to something that isn't mine for years," Tuan admitted. "I think I need to give it back. Can you walk me through it?" Wei agreed, and a week later, he stood beside Tuan as the man returned a stolen ring to its rightful owner. In moments like that, watching someone else take the step he'd once feared, Wei realized his life had shifted again. The mission had started as paying back debts, now it was about lighting the way for others to do the same. Though he'd never say it aloud, he knew the voice in the church had been right, the hardest work was still ahead, but he wasn't doing it alone. 5 years had passed since the night Wei Chen stepped into St. Michael's with a thief's plan and walked out with a different mission. The apartment above the pawn shop was long gone. In its place was a small 2-bedroom house on a quiet street in Spring Branch, its front porch catching the evening light. The walls held no stolen art or ill-gotten luxury, just framed photos, Wei in a hard hat with his construction crew, a grinning Min holding his electrician certification, and a wedding picture of Wei and Lin, the parish volunteer who'd handed him a cup of coffee after Mass and asked nothing about his past. Lin knew his history from the start. "If you've been forgiven," she once told him, "I can love the man you've become." Their daughter, Mei, was 3 now, curious, fearless, already asking why her father wore the silver crucifix around his neck every day. Wei's life was simple, early mornings on job sites, evenings at home or St. Michael's, weekends sometimes spent driving to small towns to speak at church groups or community centers. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest, and earned. In the parish records, Father Liang kept a note under Wei's name, "Witness to Conversion." Wei didn't claim the title, but in the community, it stuck. People stopped him at the hardware store, in grocery aisles, on sidewalks, saying they'd heard his story. Some said it gave them hope for a brother or son who'd lost their way. Others just wanted to shake his hand. The list of past victims had grown shorter. Some debts were paid in full, others could never be repaid in money, only in effort and time. Wei kept the list in his nightstand's top drawer, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the road he was still walking. One autumn evening, he stood again before the Blessed Mother's statue at St. Michael's. The candles flickered in their glass holders, casting the same soft glow he remembered from that night years ago. He didn't hear a voice this time. He didn't need to. The peace in his chest was answer enough. From the pews, Min watched quietly, hands in his jacket pockets. He'd brought 2 younger guys from his neighborhood, both on the edge of trouble. "He's the one I told you about," Min whispered. "If he could change, so can we." Wei knelt for a moment, not in desperation, but in gratitude, for the work still to do, the second chance he'd been given, and the unseen grace that had met him in his darkest night. Life hadn't become easy. There were still bills, long hours, moments when old instincts whispered quick, dishonest solutions. But each time, Wei remembered the marble floor under his knees, the weight of those words, "You already know what to do." He'd come to understand that redemption wasn't a single moment. It was a life built one right choice at a time, and the past, no matter how dark, didn't have to be a prison. Looking back, Wei often thought about those who doubted him and those who'd believed in him without reason. His journey wasn't his alone, it was woven with every hand that pushed him forward, every person who let him make amends. For anyone who heard his story, his message was always the same: it doesn't matter how far you've gone in the wrong direction. There's always a way back. You can't undo the past, but you can decide what you do next. And when you decide to come home, you never walk alone.